Conquering Heaven by Assault, the Paris Commune. The year that is ending has been the 140th anniversary of the Paris Commune. This anniversary, in addition to remembering the heroes who launched themselves into the conquest of heaven by assault, gives us an opportunity to look at that experience and try to better understand from our days and from historical materialism the deep meaning of those Parisian months. The petty bourgeoisie and the proletarian revolution. To be consistent with the dialectic, the experience of the Commune can only make sense for Marxists from the study of the struggling classes. So we want to start this small study looking at the petty bourgeoisie of yesterday and today. This class today seems to be under the influence of the big bourgeoisie, and in the Spanish state has believed one of the mantras repeated by the PP in the last electoral campaign, that entrepreneurs and SMEs are the basis of the country's wealth. This would make anyone who knows something about economics blush with shame when remembering the weight that companies such as Repsol, Telefonica, Banco Santander, etc., which are not exactly small and medium-sized companies, have in shaping GDP. The situation is more dramatic if we remember that the PP was in charge of giving this petty bourgeoisie the well-being of the last 15 years by the hand of the real estate sector, from whose growth it has benefited, but which has been its tomb, since it has only served to deepen the crisis of this class when the problem of overproduction has appeared. The economic project of Aznar's party for this class has consisted of raising it to let it fall when the trend of the economic cycle changes. It does not stop producing a certain astapor to see how the ruined petty bourgeoisie responds to the calls of the PP, while its policies are responsible for its rise and recent fall in the Spanish state. As in France in 1871, today the petty bourgeoisie is drowned by debts. However, this class then found an unexpected solution by another class. It did not happen as almost always, when it is the big bourgeoisie who gives him oxygen balloons in exchange for his support. The Commune saved them, through a shrewd solution to the constant source of discord within the same middle class, the conflict between creditors and debtors. These same elements of the middle class, after having collaborated in the crushing of the workers' insurrection of June 1848, had been sacrificed without regard to their creditors by the Constituent Assembly of the time. The decree of the Paris Commune of April 16, 1871 extended the payments of debts for 3 years by abolishing the payment of interest. The problems of this kind were solved effectively by the revolutionary proletariat, but this was only one more problem to which it tried to solve. As we have been saying, the problem of debts was mainly a problem that concerned the petty bourgeoisie and that only found an effective solution under the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, today there are those who may think that the demands around these economic problems were the engine of the Paris Commune following the scheme of accumulation of forces for the revolution. For a long period, the working class accumulates forces around specific economic demands, increase in wages, reduction in working hours, etc., waiting for the situation to be mature enough to make the revolution in a moment of crisis of capitalism. This model relegates the task of the revolutionaries to waiting for the opportune moment in which to jump to the stage of the direction of the revolution, and makes the revolution depend on the cyclical economic crises of capitalism, which means eliminating much of the autonomy to the revolutionary class, since it could not choose either the moment or the place. Following this model, the insurrection that founded the Paris Commune was simply due to long years of strengthening of workers' organizations, such as the Confederation of Trade Union Chambers or the International, that would have been wearing down the state until the defeat of the Franco-Prussian War marked the right moment to take power. As we will try to demonstrate in this article, this spontaneous revolutionary paradigm that we have just described in general terms had its historical validity and worked very well precisely until 1871, while the bourgeoisie was a revolutionary class. In the Paris Commune, an unprecedented event occurs, because for the first time it is the proletariat that takes power, but armed with the bourgeois revolutionary paradigm, that is, the spontaneous insurrection that triumphs because it has been able to drag the masses. The importance of the Commune lies in this, in which the limitations of this paradigm applied to the proletarian revolution will be highlighted. This superposition of proletarian and bourgeois elements was necessary because until that moment the bourgeoisie was the only class that had completed a revolution, so the new revolutionary class could only learn from the old. Of course, however, learning from the old is not repeating it over and over again. With its revolutionary praxis, the Parisian working class taught the limits of the bourgeois model, facing unprecedented problems. Marx, Engels, and Lenin took stock of this experience that paved the way for revolution. In the same way, now it is up to the vanguard to take stock of the October cycle. One of the tasks of this balance is to unravel the historical premises of the proletariat during the cycle, and it is here that the Commune becomes important, since it is in this one where bourgeois elements of the insurrectionary revolutionary model are mixed with the new elements contributed by the proletariat. This article aims to point out some of the elements of the old and the new with the perspective that gives all the revolutionary experience after the Commune. For this it is necessary to start with the great revolutionary reference of the moment, the French Revolution. Paradigm premises, the revolution as a political resource itself. The experience of the Commune is incomprehensible to us today if we do not take into account one of the fundamental social premises of the 19th and 20th centuries, the use of the revolution as a political mechanism for social transformation. The period 1789 to 1989, in which the October cycle is framed, was deeply influenced by the model of the French Revolution. The light of this experience marked a way of doing things, a revolutionary paradigm that took root in the heads of the revolutionaries of 2 centuries, so it is important that we stop for a moment in the French experience. The model of the French Revolution responds to the needs of a new class, the bourgeoisie, which has been growing over the centuries within feudal relations thanks to the development of trade. The contradictions between the new class and the feudal class had already been resolved in favor of the bourgeoisie in countries like England. However, in France the resistance of the feudal class forced the bourgeoisie in a revolutionary way of unprecedented intensity. When the French bourgeoisie is not satisfied with the purchase of titles of nobility, but the development of its own class interests requires the demolition of feudal structures and their consequences, social privileges sanctioned by law, heterogeneity of legislation, limitations on trade, for the consolidation of the internal market, it does not hesitate to demand it from the reactionary classes from their own organisms, the feudal parliament that were the States General. So far it is a class that has grown and that tries to reach a pact with the old class to exercise its domination. What changes everything is the rejection of the old feudal class to give up any privilege, pushing the bourgeoisie to the revolutionary way to impose its interests. The French bourgeoisie is forced to become revolutionary, and with it drags all the classes oppressed by feudalism after the promise of freedom, equality, and fraternity, triggering a totally unprecedented social mobilization. Once it is completely broken with the feudal class, the French bourgeoisie could only rely on the urban masses and the peasantry to ensure their conquests, and to this alliance responds the Jacobin Convention and the Terror of 1793. The left wing of the revolutionary bourgeoisie responds to the pressures of the peasantry and the urban masses in exchange for consolidating and defending the new bourgeois state. This meant a political mobilization of the masses that went far beyond any peasant riot. The mass leave to defend the nation would have been much more difficult if before the bourgeoisie had not responded to the peasant demands, abolition of feudal property, and had mobilized the masses for the exercise of terror against the dominant elements of the old society. This mass mobilization will run the risk of overflowing against bourgeois interests. So a more moderate faction of the bourgeoisie ends up displacing the Jacobins from power through the Thermidor coup as soon as the danger of invasion has been momentarily conjured. From this experience 2 consequences are derived that will have a wide scale during the following 2 centuries. The first is the way of making the revolution. The bourgeoisie had been patiently growing within the structures of feudalism. When this class is mature and the right time comes, it launches for the state, dragging in its movement the masses that until that moment shared the same social place in the old regime, the third state. This is the spontaneous insurrectionary model that unconsciously became part of the modus operandi of both bourgeois and proletarian revolutionaries. There was simply no other way to make the revolution, when in the February Revolution we were all, with regard to our way of representing ourselves, the conditions and the course of revolutionary movements, under the fascination of the previous historical experience, particularly that of France. Wasn't it precisely from this country, which had played the first role in all of European history since 1789, from which the signal for general subversion had also now left again? The problem with this paradigm arises when the bourgeoisie ceases to be the ruling class of the revolution to become the proletariat, along with the social changes that have occurred since 1789. The social mechanisms that were valid then for the bourgeoisie do not work so well for the proletariat of 1871 or 1917. The proletariat had inherited a revolutionary model that only served it to a certain extent, hence the efforts of the greats of Marxism to find a solution to the limitations of this. Although it did not serve as perfectly for the proletariat as for the bourgeoisie, at the height of 1871 the spontaneous bourgeois paradigm still served perfectly to mobilize the masses. This is due to the second consequence of the profound depth of 1793, the profound influence that the revolution had on the whole of society as a resource for social transformation. Most people who lived in Europe and America between 1789 and 1848 participated in or witnessed the revolutionary transformation of society. The revolution was a real possibility, and its mechanisms were assimilated in society. The speed and frequency with which insurrections spread throughout 19th century Europe prove the vitality of the recourse to the revolution. It is precisely this second consequence that partially solves the limitations of the insurrectionary revolutionary paradigm for the proletariat indicated above, because it facilitated the spontaneous mobilization of the masses. This recourse to revolution will remain alive in society when the bourgeoisie ceases to be a revolutionary class to become reactionary, because the proletariat will know how to take over as a class, with revolutionary initiative. This is because, in the heat of the bourgeois revolution, the working class is gradually being shaped as a class differentiated from the others. The formation of the proletariat as a class in itself occurs through concrete economic struggles, which allow the class to become aware of its existence as a class. This awareness as a class in itself, in a period where revolution is the order of the day, allows us to understand how the proletariat inherits from the bourgeoisie the condition of revolutionary class. Understanding this relief is of vital importance for today's revolutionaries, because the proletarian revolution is born from the elements provided by the bourgeois revolution, something that, although it scandalizes some would-be Marxists, is completely coherent if the dialectic of the class struggle is understood. This happened for the first time in 1848. The liberal bourgeois of the parliamentary opposition organized banquets in which they advocated an electoral reform that should guarantee the domination of their party. Being increasingly forced to appeal to the people in the struggle they held against the government, they had no choice but to give primacy to the radical and republican layers of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie. But behind these sectors were the revolutionary workers, who since 1830 had acquired much more political independence than the bourgeois and even the republicans imagined. As we see, the proletariat, once defined as a class, begins to act politically as a revolutionary class, because it is in a revolutionary context in which it has been formed. The problem lies in the fact that the tools with which the bourgeoisie makes the revolution are not the same with which the proletariat must do it. That was why Lenin designed the new type party, or M.A.I, the military theory of the working class that is the popular war, GP. These greats were able to reach these conclusions thanks to the balance of the previous revolutionary experience. Lenin with the Paris Commune and the Revolution of 1905, and M.A.I with the critical study of the Soviet experience. As we can see, the balance is one of the best traditions of Marxism, and when it is carried out it allows you to advance in giant steps. The other option is to continue maintaining our revolutionary ideology in formaldehyde, hoping that it will guide us from there. You choose. Let's go back to the social consequences that 1793 had for the revolution. As we have said, we highlight two far-reaching consequences: a revolutionary model that works perfectly, the spontaneous insurrection that arises from the experience of the bourgeois revolution, and the real recourse to the revolutionary transformation of society, which is observed by the multiplication of insurrections throughout Europe and America from 1789. With these two elements, the proletariat begins to act once it defines itself economically as a class differentiated from the others. The simultaneity of the two elements that we are describing allowed a formulation of proletarian revolution, the natural daughter of the bourgeois revolution model that worked to a certain extent. When the appropriate conditions are given, when a period of crisis appears, the revolutionary elements prepare an insurrection to which the working class will be added that has been trained for this definitive assault through their economic claims. Is it familiar? This is the revolutionary program that today implicitly or explicitly share from the revisionist communists' friends of the accumulation of forces to the insurrectional anarchists, and that was already criticized in its day, educated in the school of conspiracy and kept in cohesion by the rigid discipline that this school implies. The Blanquists started from the idea that a relatively small group of determined and well-organized men would be in a position not only to take over the state rudder at a favorable time, but that, deploying an energetic and tireless action, would be able to sustain themselves until they managed to drag the masses of the people to the revolution and gather them around a handful of caudillos. If this model fit perfectly to the bourgeois revolutions, for the proletariat it will hardly serve to take power but not to keep it. The Commune is the latest example of a triumphant insurrection. The sister insurrections of this one in Lyon, Narbonne, Toulouse, Marseille, Saint-Étienne and Le Creuset are quickly crushed, as will be the insurrections of the Russian Revolution of 1905, the tragic week of Barcelona, the Spartacist insurrection in Berlin. The only exception seems to be October, which, although it is true that it was guided by this spontaneous conception, triumphs to the extent that it breaks dialectically with it, being reformulated mainly by three elements: Lenin's new type party, the role of the Soviets as a new power, and the Civil War. From the M.A.I. we consider that this paradigm was necessary in its time. It could not be otherwise because, being consistent with historical materialism, the working class of the 19th century is the daughter of the social, political, and cultural conditions of the 19th century. The duty of revolutionaries is to understand these experiences and draw lessons. As we have said before, the opposite is to keep Marxism in formaldehyde instead of nourishing it with the reality of the class struggle. This attitude that we censor could stay there. However, the criminal thing is to insist on repeating the old schemes that can only end in defeat. The relative ease with which the insurrections at the height of 1871 lit explains in part the success of the Commune, and allowed to solve to a certain extent the limitations that the spontaneous insurrectional paradigm posed for the proletarian revolution. At the time of 1871, the proletarian revolution is already possible because this class is consolidated as a class in itself independent of the political initiative of the bourgeoisie. In fact, the Paris Commune is the first manifestation of this class as a revolutionary class, that is, with the will to carry out its own revolution. This is the importance of the Paris Commune. It closes the bourgeois revolution and puts the proletarian revolution on the agenda. It is the point where the two revolutions historically link, and a proof of this is the question of the state. If you look at the last chapter of my 18 Brumaire, you will see that I expose as the next attempt of the French Revolution not to pass from one hand to another the bureaucratic military machine, as had been happening until now, if not to demolish it, and this is precisely the precondition of every true popular revolution on the continent. This, precisely, consists of the attempt of our heroic comrades of Paris. As a result of the new land they stepped on, the working class could not act with respect to the state as the bourgeoisie had done with the absolutist state it inherited. All revolutions perfected this machine, the state, instead of destroying it. The parties that fought alternately for domination considered the inauguration of this immense state building as the main spoils of the winter. However, the proletariat for the first time in power in the Paris of 1871 will act in a very different way from the bourgeoisie with respect to the state. Instead of reinforcing it, it will dedicate itself to destroying it. This is one of the differences between bourgeois revolution and proletarian. To these differences, to that different content of the two revolutions will therefore correspond to different revolutionary models. Let's take a closer look at some of those differences that are already pointed out in the Commune episode. Development of the Commune, power vacuum, and national war. As is known, the Second Empire, 1851 to 1870, involved a great economic development. His regime stimulated speculation and industrial activities, in a word, the rise and enrichment of the entire bourgeoisie in hitherto unknown proportions. However, its own development generated the causes of its fall. It was impossible for a French empire to exist in the long run within the borders of the old monarchy, even more so, within the even more amputated borders of 1815. This implied the need for accidental wars and to widen borders. The foreign policy of the Second Empire was characterized by adventurism such as the intervention in Mexico that ended in a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Mexican patriots, or the intervention against the Republic of Rome with the intention of restoring the papal power that had been overthrown by an insurrection. The last war of aggression of the Second Empire meant its ruin. The objective was to widen the borders of the empire in the east at the expense of Prussia, which was not considered a great military rival. However, the Prussian state proved to be much better prepared for war than the empire in the victory of Sedan with the capture of the emperor and the siege of Paris. The crisis of the empire due to war translates into the proclamation of the Third Republic on September 4, 1870. The description that a witness makes of the proclamation of the Republic is interesting because it reflects one of the premises created in 1793 and commented above. The use of revolution by the masses. It is a government commission appointed by the Assembly. It is the peace requested, accepted at all costs. It is, to make its best, the more or less parliamentary monarchy. A new ways knocks down the doors, fills the room, expels or overwhelms the deputies. Gambetta, thrown into the gallery, has to announce the dismissal. The people want even more, the Republic, and take over the deputies of the left to go and proclaim it to the Hôtel de Ville. Here, the Parisian urban masses assault the meeting of the effective government of France, composed of the elected deputies of the empire, before the double fear that this government will sign peace with Prussia and that the new government will adopt the form of a monarchy. Compare this assault with the events of June 15, 2011 in Barcelona, and you can see the great difference that there is in our time in the revolutionary mobilization of masses. In the 19th century and much of the 20th century, it was relatively easy to drag the masses to a revolutionary action that, at least, had political consequences. However, what happened in Barcelona, despite having been born from the wider mass movement of recent years, was only able to mobilize the most determined sectors of the movement, which subtracted quite a few forces. This fact, far from imposing an impossibility of the Lamentive Revolution, poses an unprecedented problem that the revolutionaries must solve. How to give revolutionary initiative to the masses? In the past, this initiative was simply there or was taken for granted, but now we must face this new situation, and from the M.A.I. we are convinced that the solution to this problem inevitably passes through the political and ideological reconstitution on the elements of new plant that sanctions the balance. Returning to the Commune, as can be seen, the masses do not mobilize for any economic issue such as the high cost of living or rental debts, but mobilize for two things: patriotism and in favor of the Republic, that is, based on political issues. On patriotism as a factor of mobilization, Marx, aware that revolutionary criticism is indispensable for the development of the revolution, already warned the Parisian proletariat shortly after the proclamation of the Third Republic. This lesson teaches that revolutionaries can never reconcile in their movement with the petty bourgeoisie and must always and at all times point out, without hiding in realpolitik, what is a practice of the revolutionary proletariat and what is not. And that the moment does not justify the disagreement with respect to the principles and tasks of the class, nor the deviations owned or committed in solidarity of this or that organization or movement, because that is opportunism, as we have been pointing out successively from the M.A.I. French workers must fulfill their duty as citizens, but, at the same time, they must not be carried away by the national memories of 1792, as the French peasants were fooled by the national memories of the First Empire. As for the vindication of the Republic, this was understood by the proletariat as the only possible form of state in which to impose its interests of revolutionary class, that is, to abolish capitalism, but given the degree of ideological political development, no one knew how to do it, thanks to the economic and political development of France from 1789. The situation in Paris for 50 years has been such that no revolution could break out there that did not assume a proletarian character. That is, without the proletariat, which had paid for victory with its blood, presenting its own claims after the triumph achieved. These claims were more or less lack of clarity and even completely confusing, according to the degree of development of the workers of Paris on each occasion, but, ultimately, they were always reduced to the elimination of class antagonism between capitalists and workers. Of course, no one knew how this could be achieved. But the claim itself, no matter how vague the way of formulating it was, already contained a threat to the existing social order. The workers who raised it were still armed, therefore, the disarmament of the workers was the first commandment of the bourgeois who were at the helm of the state. It is thanks to experiences such as the Commune that the class learns. In the Commune, we learned that the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be exercised using the old state, but for this the balance of experience was essential. Let's continue to refuse to take stock and leave the development of our ideology dead. What happened after this revolution proclaimed by the Republic? From this moment on, two powers, or two opposing ways of understanding the Republic, begin to form, on the one hand the bourgeois and on the other the proletarian. These two classes will try to impose their interests, starting with the most pressing given the risk of military crisis with the Prussian army besieging Paris. The new Republican government that emerged on September 4th takes the form of a national defense government, and in it Le Sagare already gives us clues about the two antagonistic tendencies that will dispute the new Republic. This already belonged to the town. In the courtyard of honor, the tricolor flag and the red flag were disputed over the field, applauded by some and whistled by others. About General Trochu, who would be the president of the government, he demanded that God be guaranteed, and asked for the presidency. He was asked for this and the rest. And about the left-wing elements in the government, 5 of these 12 men were the ones who had lost the Republic of 48. In this way we have that from the bankruptcy of the empire appears a republic that houses within it two opposing tendencies. How do these develop until the Civil War is declared? Parallel to the proclamation of the Republic, the National Guard, GN, an armed mass organization created in the Revolution of 1830 by the bourgeoisie as an urban militia, had been recomposed. Initially, only voters, remember that census suffrage was the norm until the Revolution of 1848, who could pay for their military equipment could enter the GN. This had turned this organization into a bourgeois police force, and its importance had been declining over the decades. However, the Prussian danger reborn this organization in 1870, only now, in a proletarian Paris, the GN had become a proletarian army. On the 14th, when Trochu was reviewing the National Guard, 300,000 men stepped on the boulevards, the Place de la Concorde and the Champs-Élysées, broke out an immense acclamation. carrying out an act of faith similar to that of his parents on the morning of M.A.I. The bourgeoisie had once again mobilized the masses under one of the few flags that could still do so, the nation in danger, precisely because in 1793, unlike today, the nation was a revolutionary element. Let's not forget that it is the bourgeoisie that historically creates nations in its revolution. The defense of the nation was one of the few excuses with which the bourgeoisie could use the working class. Yes, Paris surrendered unreservedly to this left, which it had had to rape for the revolution. His impulse of will did not last more than an hour. Once the empire was thrown to the ground, he believed that everything was over and abdicated again. As you can see, the class struggle is imposed, and although the people are able to overthrow governments, the bourgeoisie maneuvers and is able to redirect the situation towards their interests, in this case, reach peace with Prussia. On September 20th, contacts begin to establish the conditions of peace, but trying to maintain a position of strength. That is why they need the workers mobilized under the idea of defending the nation in danger. Already in the Revolution of 1848, the participation of the proletariat makes it overflow beyond what is desirable by the bourgeoisie, and it must resort to a massacre of workers to repress the June insurrection. In the Paris that goes from the proclamation of the Republic to the proclamation of the Commune 7 months later, the bourgeoisie will try to prevent the situation from overturning by trying to contain the mass mobilization that it itself has promoted for national defense, while at the same time preparing the armistice with Prussia. This tension has one of its peaks on October 31st, when the city learns of the capitulation of the Metz fortress, where the remains of the French army had been besieged for months, the loss of Le Bourget, an enclave north of Paris recently conquered by the troops of Paris, and the signing of an armistice with Prussia. This triple news leads to an insurrection that manages to momentarily capture the members of the National Defense Government in the Hôtel de Ville. However, this insurrection also ends up failing. The National Defense Government continues on the one hand trying to appease the masses who want to defend Paris and on the other to lay the foundations of peace with Prussia. This tactic responds to the suicide raid of January 18th, in which the best battalions of the GN were used in order to wear them out. The discomfort caused by the government's defense policy and its will to capitulate translates into a new insurrection on January 22nd that does not triumph either. 5 days later, the capitulation is signed. The Prussian army occupies the forts defending Paris, and the units of the French army are disarmed and taken prisoner. However, the GN is not disarmed, which will be of vital importance for the success of the Commune, but Paris in arms was the revolution in arms. The triumph of Paris over the Prussian aggressor would have been the triumph of the French worker over the French capitalist and his parasites within the state. In this conflict between national duty and class interest, the National Defense Government did not hesitate to become a government of national betrayal. On February 8th, elections are called for the National Assembly of the Republic. The elected majority is monarchical, a consequence of the peasant vote. To the reactionary danger is added the humiliation of the capitulation by the National Defense Government, a humiliation already deepened when the preliminary conditions were known: cession of Alsace and Lorraine to Prussia and payment of a war compensation. From this moment until the proclamation of the Commune, the organizations with which the working class unconsciously endows itself and that will allow it to exercise its dictatorship are maturing. It is these organizations, GN and its Central Committee and the Central Committee of the 20 districts mainly, that allow the Parisian proletariat to go beyond the spontaneous paradigm of the bourgeois revolutions, and their successes will be explained to the extent that they are able to break with it. In this maturation, the International is important, some of whose members will be part of the final Central Committee of the GN. On the other hand, the bourgeois state is being reconstituted through the Assembly of Rural Bordeaux and the government that is installed in Versailles. Its priorities to consolidate themselves are peace at any cost with Prussia and defeat the Parisian proletariat erected through the Commune in counterpower. The revolutionary triumph of the Commune will pass through the imposition of its state and formation on the agencies of the bourgeois state in Paris. Let's take a closer look at this process and its instruments. The proletariat creates its revolutionary organizations. As has been said, the GN is a remnant of the revolutionary bourgeoisie. The National Defense Government resurrected it at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, now made up mostly of workers. Faced with the reactionary danger already sufficiently clear under the government of national betrayal and the reactionary Assembly of Bordeaux that emerged from the February elections, the GN organizes itself by federating its battalions and equipping itself with a central committee, CC, that is, it equips itself with its own organizations. The CC is formed on February 24th by election by 2,000 delegates from 200 battalions and appoints a commission to draw up the statutes of the Federation. This CC is formed in the midst of an exacerbation of the crisis. The Assembly of Bordeaux had appointed Thiers head of government and the entry of the Prussians into Paris was expected for February 27th, after the end of the armistice that extended until the 26th. This crisis provokes one of the premises for a triumph of a revolution, the power vacuum. They were trying to recompose a French state since the fall of the empire, and since the army was in decomposition, the only effective military force in Paris was that of the GN. And Paris now had only two paths: either surrender, following the humiliating orders of the slavers of Bordeaux and recognizing that its revolution of September 4th meant no more than a simple transfer of powers from Louis Bonaparte to his monarchical rivals, or continue fighting like the selfless champion of France, whose salvation from ruin and whose regeneration were impossible if the political and social conditions that had generated the Second Empire were not revolutionally overthrown and that, under the protective aegis of this, matured to total putrefaction. On February 27th, government troops retreat to the left bank of the Seine to make way for the Prussian army, which means deepening the power vacuum. That same day 40,000 armed men of the GN wait in the Champs-Élysées for the Prussians, who do not appear. One side announces that Paris will be occupied on March 1st. On March 3rd, the statutes of the GN Battalion Federation are presented, where it says that the delegates must prevent any attempt that finally has the collapse of the Republic. That is, they give themselves the function of armed force of the Republic. Both the Bordeaux Assembly and the CC speak of the same Republic, at least nominally, but both have in mind a different idea of Republic. From this moment the double power is evident. The government appoints the monarchist Durels as general of the GN in an attempt to control it and is sent to Paris. The CC rejects this appointment and responds by calling citizens to their battalion circles and legion councils, organs of the battalion federation at the battalion and district level respectively, to elect their delegates to appoint a definitive CC to be constituted on March 15th. The CC represents more and more clearly a threat to the bourgeoisie at a time when it is going through a moment of weakness that prevents it from exercising repression. M.A.I said like Vautrin, "Let's stop the Central Committee," and nothing seemed easier, since all its members inscribed their signs in the Pasquins. Picard himself replied, "I don't have a police, arrest them yourself." M.A.I replied, "That's none of my business." The NG is the military organization of the proletariat in the midst of a power vacuum caused by the crisis, to which is added the Central Committee of the 20 districts, arising from the monitoring committees of each district in charge of supervising the performance of the mayors and receiving complaints. The working class has managed to create its own organizations spontaneously, under some degree of influence of workers' organizations such as the Confederation of Trade Union Chambers and the International, to the extent that the mechanisms of the spontaneous revolutionary route were still in force, before which very soon the community members will verify their limitations. The government sought control of the GN with the appointment of Durels, against which the class unconsciously generates its organisms, before the attempt to snatch the cannons of the GN by the people of Versailles. The CC will respond with the Commune, and before the war that Versailles declares, the Commune will respond with war. All this shows the limits of spontaneity, being at the mercy of events and always responding to the enemy's blows, instead of striking first. Right now, if imperialism is the era of the proletarian revolution, this class cannot be guided by a revolutionary model that prevents it from autonomy. This is one of the important lessons of the Commune, the end of the spontaneous revolutionary model against one based on the conscious construction of the tools of the revolution, which coincides with the historical overlap of bourgeois and the proletarian revolution that occurs in the Parisian experience. After the Commune, any proletarian revolution will need a party of a new type to triumph, which generates an army to attack the bourgeoisie, create power vacuums, and install its dictatorship. Faced with this, the heroic Parisian proletariat managed to equip itself with an armed organization and a leadership that resided in the CC of the GN, maneuvering in the midst of a crisis that they had not created. The effective seizure of power by the proletariat through its organizations, the GN and its CC, takes place on March 18th with the well-known episode of the attempted capture of the GN cannons by the government of Versailles. The Versailles aggression began around 3 a.m. and around 11 a.m. has already been completely rejected. However, the GN battalions remain stationed in their neighborhoods and do not take the Hôtel de Ville and raise the red flag until 7 p.m. Despite all the failure of the Versailles and the open confrontation with the Parisian masses, they oppose the declaration of civil war and urge the CC to consolidate its power. The events of 18 push him to lead the new state. From that moment on, the CC runs Paris, but the apparent paradox is that, after just inaugurating the first dictatorship of the proletariat in history, the old bourgeois conception continues to plan. In the scheme of bourgeois revolutions, after the success of the insurrection, the next step is elections for a parliament. The CC had all the time in mind that they were the authentic representatives of the Republic proclaimed on September 4th and not the government of Versailles. But the political tools to exercise their class domination were those they had inherited from the bourgeoisie, that is, parliamentarism, as can be seen in the Pasquin published by the CC on March 19th. Citizens, the people of Paris, calm, impassive in their strength, have waited without fear and without provocation to the shameless crazy. People who wanted to touch the Republic. Let Paris and France together lay the foundations for an acclaimed republic with all its consequences, the only government that will forever close the era of invasions and civil wars. The people of Paris are summoned in their sections to hold the communal elections if the Commune is the gauze between the bourgeois revolution and the proletarian. It is because, for the first time in history, the bourgeois revolutionary impulse deployed during the first half of the 19th century is surpassed by the class that the bourgeoisie brought with it, the proletariat. This will be reflected in the civil war between the two states. Before that, the CC had to complete its victory. In Paris there were representatives of the old state, the mayors of the 20 districts in which Paris was administratively divided, and the deputies of the Rural Assembly of Bordeaux for the Department of Paris, Sena. On March 20th, the mayors claimed power from the CC, which refuses with the support of the CC of the 20 districts and the International that asked the CC to continue governing in the Hôtel de Ville. On the 21st, the mayors published a Pasquin against the elections called by the CC and positioned itself in favor of the Assembly of Bordeaux. Finally, on the 24th the CC orders to occupy the mayor's offices of Districts 1 and 2, for which they send 2 delegates from the CC, 600 men and 2 cannons. The group of mayors disintegrates. On the 25th the majority adheres to the call for elections on March 26th before the immense strength that the CC had gathered. After the disappearance of the last representatives of the old state, the working class dominates Paris, and yet, this was the first revolution in which the working class was openly recognized as the only class capable of social initiative even by the great mass of the Parisian middle class, shop-stoppers, artisans, merchants, with the sole exception of the rich capitalists. And although it is the dominant class, it knows how to attract the petty bourgeoisie, which is positioned before the double power, but this was not the only reason that led them to tighten their ranks around the working class. They felt that they had to choose between the Commune and the Empire, whatever the sign under which it resurrected. The Commune, between 1793 and October. Precisely, this illustrates one of the mechanisms of the proletarian revolution that has been manifested more and more clearly. The proletarian revolution, when it has reached the degree of civil war, consists of the development of a double power, its dictatorship opposed to that of the bourgeoisie, which ends up crushing the reactionary state. The revolutionary counterpower must be able to attract allies of other classes, demonstrating to them that the bourgeois state is incapable of responding to their interests. This took place in the Commune, and that is why the Parisian petty bourgeoisie chose the Commune to the Empire. This duality of powers that appears in the Commune will be seen more clearly in the Russian Revolution from February to October. What does this duality of power consist of? And that together with the provisional government, together with the government of the bourgeoisie, another government has been formed, still weak, embryonic, but existing without a doubt and in the process of development. The Soviets of Workers and Soldiers deputies. This power is a power of the same type as the Paris Commune of 1871. The fundamental features of this type of power are: 1. The source of power is not in a law, previously discussed and approved by Parliament, but in the direct initiative of the popular mass from below and in each place, and the direct taking of power, to use the term in vogue. 2. Substitution of the police and the army, as institutions apart from the people and opposed to it, by direct armament of the entire people. With this power the same workers and armed peasants guard public order, the same people in arms. 3. The officials and the bureaucracy are also replaced by the direct power of the people, or, at least, subjected to special control. Far from being a Soviet particularity, the double power and the creation of a new state against the old state are elements that have been confirmed in the proletarian revolutions of the October cycle, and that, as we have seen, can already be guessed in the Commune, without this detracting the importance of the originality of October that, without a doubt, surpasses the Parisian experience. In this revolutionary episode that we are dealing with, there is a mixture of new elements that coexist with the old bourgeois paradigm. As has been seen, in the midst of the social crisis due to the fall of the empire, the working class is equipped with its own organization that allows it sufficient autonomy to take and maintain power. The CC of the GN and the CC of the 20 districts. The spontaneous organization of the Parisian working class, which had been hardened in the revolutionary struggle under the bourgeois paradigm, manages to launch itself to the seizure of power as a class. At first without leaving the bourgeois democratic framework, what we are, events have told us. The repeated attacks of a press hostile to democracy have shown us, and the threats of the government have come to confirm it. We are the inexorable barrier raised against any attempt to collapse the republic. But after March 18th, a different conception is making its way, where you can see the role that members of the International have been playing, which is the result of the new ground that Parisian workers are stepping on in power, the proletarians of the capital, in the midst of the failures and betrayals of the ruling classes, have understood that the time had come for them to save the situation, taking the direction of public affairs into their own hands. The bourgeoisie, its older sister, who carried out her emancipation more than 3/4 of a century ago, does not understand that today the time has come for the emancipation of the proletariat. Why does it persist, then, in denying the proletariat its legitimate part? In this appointment it is seen how the working class is aware that it has taken power, taking the direction of public affairs into its own hands, as the bourgeoisie already did. And he recognizes in the bourgeois older sister the motherhood of the revolutionary model on which the revolutionary proletariat is nourished. How is this overlap of bourgeois democratic revolution with the proletarian one possible? It responds, firstly, to the mobilization and armament of the Parisian proletariat from the radical support for the bourgeois revolution in the face of the national betrayal of the bourgeoisie, the uncompromising defense of the only bourgeois element still capable of raising the masses, the national war, the recourse to the revolution that we comment on at the beginning of the article, and secondly, to the political crisis that the collapse of the Second Empire creates a power vacuum that is exploited by the proletariat to take power after endowing itself with its own organization. These two elements synthesize the inescapable elements for the revolution: armament of the class, political crisis and power vacuum, and a revolutionary class endowed with its own organization, that is, the Communist Party, PC. However, today it is impossible for these elements to appear as they did in the Commune, and this the power vacuum and the armament of the masses are not the result of the conscious action of the proletariat, but come from the outside, and the organization of the class is not the result of a conscious plan. That is why we say that the Commune is still partly under the influence of the bourgeois revolutionary model. It could not be otherwise. But this influence is overcome by the revolutionary action itself and opens the doors to the new, the proletarian revolution, the current historical situation, with the perspective that the historical experience of the October cycle gives us, allows us to begin to see the historical development of the novel elements of the Commune. Since the bourgeoisie ceases to be historically revolutionary when capitalism enters the imperialist phase and the era of the proletarian revolution opens, it cannot be expected that the working class will be mobilized and armed by another class that is not itself. That is where the importance and the problem of the constitution or reconstitution of the PC lies. Since capitalism is in a state of decomposition, the social crisis becomes permanent, so it makes no sense to wait for an economic crisis that incites the masses towards politics. Right now, in the midst of the economic crisis, we can see how wrong this approach is. Instead, it must be the very action of the proletariat constituted in PC that sharpens the crisis through the GP, creating power vacuums in which to install its new power. Here the famous thesis of the International, the emancipation of the proletariat can only come from the hands of the proletariat, makes full sense. If in the Commune this class could still rely to a certain extent on elements inherited from the bourgeoisie, from then on the independence of the latter and its autonomy will be essential. Unfortunately, the first dictatorship of the proletariat could only stand for several months. Marx already pointed out some errors, such as the drowned in blood the uprising of the proletariat of Paris. About 6 years after having crushed the Commune, when many of its defenders were still in prison or in exile, a new labor movement began in France. The new socialist generation, enriched with the experience of their predecessors, whose defeat had not discouraged it at all, picked up the flag that the hands of the defenders of the Commune had released and took it firmly and boldly to the cry of "Long live the social revolution! Long live the Commune!" For the revolution, not even the form of defeat is indifferent. The Commune served to give strength to the next generation, despite the immense repression and the peace of the cemeteries that the victory of Versailles meant. Compare this defeat with that of the Civil War in the Spanish state, which meant the prostration of the revolutionary movement beyond the death of our bloodthirsty dwarf and the demoralization of the proletariat, the memory of whose revolutionary martyrs, presented as defenders of the bourgeois constitutional order, has been trampled. If the Commune was defeated in its attempt to assault the heavens, when the working class was able to maintain a revolutionary civil war, the case of the Spanish state, although the revolutionary movement was annihilated through the fascist genocide, on the other hand the vanguard had abandoned the masses by defending bourgeois republican legality. At the end of the war, the masses were demoralized both by the fascist terror, but also by a republic that in essence was alien to the problems of the peasants and workers. And that demoralization still weighs today, because since the 30s there has not been a revolutionary mass movement, but more or less radical protest mass movements and attempts by avant-garde detachments to build a revolutionary movement. Beyond this, the defeat that the end of the October cycle means for Marxism does not resemble that of the Commune. More than 20 years after the fall of the wall, the revolutionary movement has still not been able to recover. The revolutionary potential of Marxism is beyond doubt. In these 20 years there has been no ideology, among which they say they are revolutionary, capable of reaching where Marxism arrived during the cycle. Only old ideologies have appeared that try to pretend new. The so-called socialism of the 21st century is nothing more than the old populist nationalism of Péron. The anti-globalization is still a heterogeneous current of various incompatible ideologies that has not been able to develop an alternative to capitalism, not to mention ideologies that represent partial claims such as environmentalism, which has been translated into by green products, and feminism that has managed to tie women to wage labor in addition to the house. So, if in recent years no political movement has emerged capable of overcoming the revolutionary achievements of the communist movement, how do you explain the inactivity of this beyond the decisive popular wars in specific countries? As we say, for the communists the form of failure should not be indifferent. The end of the cycle, the defeat of Marxism, has led to a demoralization that can only have an answer if we are able to understand the current situation. The end of the first great cycle of the world proletarian revolution, given the historically novelty of the situation, poses unprecedented problems to which we can only respond with a balance of the revolutionary experience itself, a balance that, as we have seen, is not something foreign to Marxism. Anti-imperialist movement, December 2011.